Thank you all so much for coming to our panel. We're going to be discussing how to move from a reactive to a proactive approach to regulating the sharing economy. And this is actually going to be a really interactive conversation we're going to have. So if you're sitting in the way back and you're not planning to just like sneak out and panel hop, which is totally fine if you are, consider coming up so that it's easier to all talk together. So my name is Kit Hayes. I am a campaign director at Peers. So I spend a lot of my days working on online petitions to try and get fair and safe regulations passed for things like home sharing, ride sharing, and car sharing. We have an incredible group of people here today representing trade associations, think tanks, and two of the oldest sharing economy platform players. We've got Richard Eidiin, who's co-founder and policy director of the American Sustainable Business Council. They advocate for vibrant, just, and sustainable businesses. Rick Hutchinson, who is the CEO of City CarShare, which is San Francisco's only nonprofit that's working on car sharing. Their sole mission is to improve the environment in San Francisco and our quality of life. We have Daniel Roth, who's a senior fellow at R Street, which is a think tank that's considering free market and other libertarian ideas and effective limited government. And finally, we have David London, who is senior director and head of U.S. state government relations at eBay, which at Peers we refer to as the granddaddy of the peer-to-peer economy.
Can we be an uncle?
All the time. I think granddaddy is so much more endearing, but we can say uncle if you'd like. So we're going to be digging into how to regulate the sharing economy or how to approach regulating the sharing economy in a more proactive way, which is a challenging thing because, as we've talked about a lot this morning, we tend to all pay attention when things are on fire. Just to kind of lay the groundwork a little bit, assuming everyone doesn't read sharing economy news headlines as much as I do, we've heard about a couple of things already today. The Attorney General in New York a while back subpoenaed Airbnb to get all of their host data. They wanted to see who was renting where and for how long and how much money they were making. The court ruled in Airbnb's favor today, as we've talked about, but there's a bit more to the story. The Attorney General is actually planning to issue that subpoena again, and is just going to ask for a narrower range of data. So it will probably still include a lot of people in this room, myself included. In Seattle recently, they passed a cap limit on the number of people that can use ride-sharing platforms. There's only 150 people that are able to use things like Lyft and Sidecar and UberX at any given time, which really throws off the balance, the supply and demand balance that those platforms sort of rely on to provide effective service. I read this morning that there's 10,000 taxi cab drivers that are getting ready to do an idle protest in the streets of London. And Kansas City recently issued a subpoena against Lyft as soon as they entered. And then we heard David Chu this morning say that here in San Francisco, Airbnb's hometown, there's a small war being waged on the organization. So we have a bit to think about and to think through. Before we dive in, I was hoping our panelists could just talk shortly about your role within your organizations and sort of what it has to do day to day with the sharing economy, just so we can all get grounded.
Me first?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
Well, I'm a senior fellow and director of state projects at the R Street Institute, which is a small free market think tank in DC, and I'm interested in the sharing economy because I think it's one of the most interesting instances of what the great economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction happening right now. It's an entire new paradigm by which people are rethinking how they run businesses, how they run community organizations, the very nature of what it is for something to be capital that they can put into the stream of commerce. So I think that it's I wouldn't say that I'm broadly as, I don't believe as much as some people it's going to completely revolutionize the American economy, but I think it's going to be a really important part of what we're going to see in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And I'm interested in learning and writing and trying to educate my friends who are part of the free market community and on the center right in America about what it means and why we should embrace it.
Yeah. And David London again with eBay. I'm Senior Director for U.S. State Government Relations. And as has been said, we're sort of the original or the uncle disruptor on some of the things that we've done over the years in the tech community. I first started out in eBay in the mid-2000s, and when I got to eBay, it was interesting. I would always say that 99.9% of the people I would actually meet loved eBay. I mean, just loved us. But that 1/10 of 1%, hated us with every bone in their body. And the reason for that was because we were disrupting traditional business models. So whether it be the eBay marketplace, who was going after pawnbrokers and putting them on notice that we had eBay shops across the country, or whether it was licensed auctioneers who wanted to regulate us, such as regular auctioneers, or whether it was on the banking side with our PayPal business, the fear of PayPal, where they were going with the new age of payments, or with StubHub, which is another one of our properties. A lot of primary ticket owners and ticket brokers were very concerned with StubHub. So we have been disrupting for many years, and I fight legislation across the country and my team to try to beat back these type of legislative proposals from various states and localities, and then also to try to educate folks in actually what we do and what value add we bring to the table.
Great. Well, I'm Rick Hutchinson. I'm the CEO at City CarShare. City CarShare is a 13-year-old nonprofit car sharing organization. We're the largest nonprofit car sharing organization in North America. When we began back in around 2001, car sharing was basically a European concept. And many groups started to think about shared mobility in North America. It started first in Montreal and Vancouver. It came to the United States soon afterwards. And most of them were smaller-oriented organizations that cared about a couple of things, which City CarShare still embraces. And first of all, it's how do we help the local communities, as we like to say at City CarShare, be a better place to work, play, live, and breathe. And that's what City CarShare continues to be all about. We provide a very convenient, low-cost car sharing operation, but we also do education and advocacy work, and we provide programs for all constituencies. So a lot of what we run into on the regulatory side has to do with making sure that car sharing is promoted as an extension of transit and a service that supports all communities, from the disabled to seniors, affordable housing, and also constituencies that don't have access to certain kinds of mobility. We have the largest multi-car type EV fleet in the country, and we're trying to make sure that EVs are available to low and moderate income families in areas that wouldn't necessarily get infrastructure. So we run into some regulatory things around that.
Great.
Excuse me. Good morning. I'm Richard Eidiin, the policy director and one of the co-founders of the American Sustainable Business Council. We're a business public policy group based in D.C. that is working on a wide range of issues to build what we consider a just, vibrant, and sustainable economy. And so those issues include everything from healthcare reform to regulating toxics in the environment, to climate change, to tax policy, to trade issues, to crowdfunding. And our focus is on highlighting what we would consider the responsible business community has been doing in this country for many years, and bringing that to the attention of policymakers, both in Washington and in state capitals, and making the case that businesses that are innovating and being accountable and responsible and transparent, that those initiatives are great, and that we want public policy to reflect the values that those companies embody. So to Kit's question, our interest in the sharing economy relates to looking at business models that will create greater access to a broader set of the public, that will do that at a lower cost, and do that in a way that creates new opportunities. So we're really focused on initially on the crowdfunding idea. We were involved in 2010 on that issue and have remained involved for several years now. And we can talk more about that.
Great. So the way that I think we should approach this discussion is I first want to talk a little bit as a group about what the kind of root of the issues are that we're having. Like, why is this so difficult? Why do I have a million headlines that I can read through about how troubled the sharing economy is from a regulatory perspective? I want to do that so that we can sort of frame our discussion about proactive solutions, sort of in light of how we understand the problem. So we'll have a discussion about that up here, and then I'd actually love to hear from people in the audience if you've had an experience that you've run up against a regulatory challenge. Maybe you rent your apartment on Airbnb, maybe you're a Lyft driver, maybe you have an insurance issue. It'd be wonderful just to get sort of your 30-second story out so that we can make it feel really real, because I think these things, for a lot of the people that are at this conference, we experience these challenges on an everyday basis. They're terrible for the platforms and the VCs that own them, but there's also a lot of people whose lives are affected by this, so I want to touch on that. And then we'll pivot back to brainstorming a little bit together about what kind of proactive solutions we could all be thinking about to address some of this. And I'm hoping that I have ideas that I can go back and use tomorrow. So I have a deep vested interest in this conversation. First I'm just curious what you think the sort of root of the problem is with the regulatory challenges that we're facing in the sharing economy now. David, maybe you could start us off.
Yeah, I really think it starts, with the fear and fear of change. Plain and simple. It's as basic as that. I remember Jack Welch said years ago, there's no constituency for change, permanent constituency for change. And so understanding that there are entrenched interests that are fearful, that government regulators, when they don't understand something, and you have a very well-funded adversary who's willing to tell their story to government regulators, that fear manifests itself in policies and programs that try to bring down the disruptor. So I think it really starts and begins with fear and the change that comes. I mean, I sort of think about the various tiers in our government. On the federal side, it's so removed from us mostly in our day-to-day lives. Generally speaking, state government's kind of removed from us in our lives. But what do we pay the most attention to? It's our local government. It's our potholes in our street. It's our city schools. And when those issues are very personal to people, they get very antagonistic about them. So I really think it's the fear of what you all are doing in the sharing economy and the lack of understanding from a lot of policymakers intends to do a lot of policies that may harm you.
Great.
Yeah, I would agree absolutely with that. I think there's a huge question of definition. I think that even within the sharing economy, people who are involved in the sharing economy and platforms are legislating for it. We don't have some firm definitions. The key one right now is around ride sharing. At the federal level, they consider ride sharing very different than the media now talks about ride sharing when it's referring to Uber, Lyft, and Sidecar and companies like that. So when you have problems with definition and you have disruptive platforms, technologies, or just ideas, you're going to have policymakers who are going to take a step back and worry about what the impact is going to be, and you're going to have constituencies that are going to be disenfranchised as well if they don't understand what the driving force is. The last thing I'll say about that is anytime you have market gaps and something comes in to fill that market gap, which is what we're seeing with the sharing economy, you're going to have not just disruption for disruption's sake, you're going to have a change in behavior that is going to occur. And that change in behavior is going to have unintended consequences. And right now we have a lot of unintended consequences from good people trying to do good work and in the sharing economy. So I think that is one of the major root causes as well.
Yeah, I'd love to dig into two things you just said a little bit further. One, this sharing economy definition issue, which I'm surprised. I feel like maybe we're tired of talking about it. It hasn't come up much yet, but there's a lot of debate about why call it sharing. Should it be the peer production thing? I mean, there's at sort of a meta level, we can't decide what to call sharing. And then, yeah, within all these different verticals, we also can't decide how to define what they are. Does anyone have a thought on how sort of self-interest from all of these different groups is sort of driving some of that? It feels a little bit like certain groups are advocating for definitions that serve their interests potentially.
Yeah, well, yeah. Kate, one of the thoughts I had is that in other industries who have had to self-regulate for a while, and then create trust with policymakers and regulators, they've created a set of standards. So if you think about Benefit Corporation, which now is passed in 23 states, one of the elements of success with Benefit Corporation is they've created this third-party set of standards. And they've done that in concert with lots of other organizations. So they've legitimized the notion that you can incorporate your company on with a different set of values and succeed. And that has appealed to conservatives and liberals. United States Green Building Council is another great example where LEED certification, voluntary initiative has now been adopted by policymakers across the country. So that's hard work to create a standard, but I think this industry would be well served by understanding how to bring stakeholders together. Everyone's not going to get everything they want, but identifying some common threshold of definition and standards that is verifiable, comprehensive, meet a few other criteria would go a long way to pacifying regulators who are unclear about what this means and clearly are responding to constituents who make campaign contributions, who have their ear, who they know, and who have relationships with that, with those regulators. So standards, certification, I think is a good way to go to definition.
Yeah, that's great.
And I think this may be a larger issue, is that different people and different participants within the sharing economy are doing it for different reasons. There's an aspect of it that is a political movement, and there's an aspect of it that's an economic movement. And I think to some level, sometimes when you come to regulators and policymakers, if you try to show one side, the other side gets lost in the shuffle. And so I think there may be some lack of clarity, especially in more conservative areas, about what exactly is happening. Is this ride sharing, or is this the vanguard of the people's revolution? I think different people say different things, and so the message gets a little bit muddied.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the other thing, Rick, that you brought up that I think might be worth digging into a little bit further are some of the unintended consequences of the incredible velocity of the sharing economy and how much it's taken off all over the globe. Does anyone have a thought or an experience or something you've witnessed that, like, oh, wow, we all started sharing our stuff and then, oops, this happened, that maybe wasn't as positive?
I think the obvious one right now is, there's a couple obvious ones, and that is, you mentioned one earlier today that someone, or actually, who's the one you got, your Airbnb host got evicted. Right?
Yeah, just on Friday, I was supposed to be staying in an Airbnb a couple blocks away from here, and on Friday I got a message from my host saying that she was being evicted, and I don't know for sure it was because she was hosting people in her apartment, but given the fact that she indicated she has 3 days to leave, I think that that's probably the case.
I think that, fundamental to the challenge of the success of the sharing economy is accommodating some of the existing rules and infrastructure that guides the economy. And, so one of the unintended consequences, clearly, from a policy perspective and a regulator's perspective, is not paying tax. And so that causes a lot of consternation among policymakers who, for better or worse, are responsible for distributing, for collecting and distributing taxes and hopefully making wise, smart decisions, not always, but about how those tax receipts are being spent. And so, again, I think that's just a fundamental challenge that this movement faces as to where it comes down around contributing to the public good and weighing in on what it wants its tax contributions to be spent for.
Right.
And my sense is unless that's addressed, it's going to continue to run into sector by sector, industry by industry opposition.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, one of the things that we've done throughout the years is really, is educate. Plain and simple. And when we weren't educating, that's when we kind of got into trouble. And so I think it's really paramount to educate early as much as possible with regulators and policymakers across the country in your individual cities. Because once they understand, because they're hearing one side of the story, and the one side of the story, as you said, is very slanted to obviously the incumbents. But if you tell your story, what you're doing, how you're benefiting consumers, and then also saying, look, in the future, we may have to look at our business, certain things in our business practices to sort of accommodate current regulatory structures. Not give in, but saying, let's be open to things. One of the worst things I've always seen is when people go into an office and say, no, we're never doing X, Y, and Z, And I've never known a politician who likes hearing, we'll never do. And when that happens, you're already on the adversarial side. And so you want to stay strong to your beliefs and your convictions and what you're doing, but at the same time, leave some room for open dialogue, because all politicians really want is a dialogue with folks.
Yeah. And what about can we talk a little bit about what everybody kind of stands to gain or lose, depending on how the kind of rules are drawn up? So there's sort of entrenched incumbents and the people that work for those companies. There's platforms and all of their communities. There's regulators themselves who are now probably have 3 times as much work as maybe they did before, because there's a new vertical that needs regulation, feels like every other day. There's cities themselves, states, countries. Can we talk a little bit about like what's up for grabs, or what people stand to lose as a result of how these lines are drawn?
What comes to mind for me is in the solar electric industry, in the photovoltaics back in the 1990s and last decade, I think there's a good parallel here. Those were very disruptive technologies, and they very much, and still do, threaten the conventional utility model, where I own the power plant and I'm selling you the electricity. It's regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. But when the industry began and companies wanted to install a photovoltaic system on your house, you, the homeowner, had to get that approved by the utility. They would have to approve your equipment. They'd have to then negotiate an agreement with you. So that's all changed, fortunately. And in part it changed because the utilities figured out how they could benefit from that. And so now there are more standard rules around net metering and how you can interconnect with the grid and how you can sell back and how equipment can be installed and leasing. And I think there's a parallel kit to this industry working with regulators and then working with the entrenched or incumbent or dominant interest to find ways where we can all make some progress, because it's extremely unlikely that taxi services are going to go away, at least in my opinion. But how can we adopt some rules that benefit both the new and the old?
Yeah.
I think you raise a great point there on the incentives question, and that's what I've seen missing from a lot of the debate here is what are the incentives of all of the different players within this area? And I think it's important to think about the incentives of elected legislators and the incentives of regulators differently. Mm-hmm. Legislators are ultimately, for better or worse, responsive to voters. They can be voted out of office. It's very hard to fire a regulator. It doesn't happen very often. And the reality is, especially on the local and municipal level, but also to a degree on the national level, a lot of regulators are what's called captured by the interests that they regulate. Mm-hmm. We see that in Washington, D.C., where the Taxi and Livery Commission is extremely powerful. It can deliver votes that swing a mayoral election. And the regulatory bodies there they're beginning to come around, but they've been very interested, as regulators want to be, in entrenching their own power rather than just throwing up their hands and saying, hey, this is great, there's a lot of competition out there, let's let 1,000 flowers bloom.
You often don't hear them saying that. Right.
Well, one of the things, and I'll go to another quote in one of my favorite movies of mine, Risky Business, when Guido said to Joel, he said, Joel, never mess with another man's livelihood, and there's something to that effect. And when you're seeing that out there, when you're messing with other people's livelihoods, rightly or wrongly, they get very angry, they get very upset, and they want to sort of bring you into the regulatory fold. One of the areas that's kind of helped us out throughout the years is early on trying to develop back to a dialogue again with the other side, I mean, I think what you'll see eventually is that they'll come your way, because it's in their business interest to do that. If they see this is where the economy is going, this is where the sharing economy is going with their business practices, they will adopt that. But in the meantime, I would start dialogue where you can and try to bring them into the fold. It's going to be tough, it's going to be painful, but at the end of the day, at least you understand what the other person's interests are. Because when you understand what somebody else's interests are, it's a lot easier to have that good debate with them in public or behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And I think to that point, I think there's a real opportunity to look at the shared values or the common goals, and employment and maintaining infrastructure. These are all, that everyone in the taxi industry and the housing industry could agree we have a similar set of goals. How we're going to get there will vary. But developing a set of commonly held principles is a great way to start that dialogue. And then, then you have to work out the details, but at least we can agree to the macro objectives here.
Yeah, that's great. I want to pause there and just hear if there's anyone in the audience, and it's fine if you're shy or there's not, but if anyone's had an experience where they've sort of run up against a sharing economy regulatory problem, it'd be great just to hear a quick 30 seconds or so on what that experience has been like, just so we can understand what it kind of feels like in real life. Is that Raphael there? Yeah? I think there's one coming there.
Hi, I'm Rafael. I'm from Madrid, Spain, and we were reactive. Basically reactive because there was a new draft on the home sharing law, and Airbnb was going to be banned, and we were all becoming illegal. A lot of people were very scared, so we wanted to act, but we could not be proactive. We had to react to the news, to the hotel lobby criticisms, and but we couldn't do anything else. Once we were able to talk with the town hall and really listen to them, and then we felt safe. Then we were able to become proactive. So my question is, how can you become proactive when you are in survival mode?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Any other thoughts to share? Looks like there's one over here. We'll hold on to that question and come back to it.
My name is Matthew DeSario. I live in Silver Lake, California. So my experience started about a year ago. In our community, we heard that there were existing incumbents in our local council, in our local elected office, that had first proposed a ban of Airbnb. At that point, it was their belief that Airbnb and short-term rentals and home sharing was legal, but that it shouldn't be. And so they took the position that they wanted to create a ban and recommend to the city that, hey, our community has decided, but through the neighborhood council, that we don't like these, and we want to get rid of them. And that was sort of my first warning shot that there was some pushback against us. So we showed up to the subsequent meeting, and a lot of people showed up. We mobilized using the Airbnb system, using FlipKey and HomeAway to get people in our community to say, hey, this is not a fringe behavior. A lot of people are engaging in this. A lot of people are invested in this sharing economy, and we'd like to have a discussion. We don't want you to ban it. We want to at least talk about maybe regulating it. And we got great groundswell and great support, but my experience is that they were not convinced. They felt that they were speaking, in their opinion, for a silent majority, a majority that didn't really want to show up, but cared equally passionately, or more passionately, in their opinion. And so my experience with this is that after speaking up and sort of thinking that we could move the conversation forward, several of us that were on this panel and sort of provided a pro-home sharing counterbalance. The city attorney and the Department of Building and Safety were involved. I got targeted. I got reported by someone who doesn't live near me, who was actually involved in creating the panel and was involved with drafting this motion to ban Airbnb. And that experience obviously was, we were very reactive. I felt very defensive. I felt like I was in triage mode. And what happened was we went through that process where the inspector came over, and I had no experience with inspectors, so I let him in, and he was really honest. He said, we really can't enforce short-term rentals or home sharing. He's like, because what are we going to do? You say it's your cousin, or it's your brother-in-law, it's your, someone that you know, or a friend, we can't enforce it. But he took pictures just to prove that there weren't short-term rentals, and I wound up getting cited for a lot of secondary violations, like my toilet was 3/4 of an inch too close to the wall. I had a chimney that had been there for like 90 years that apparently they didn't have, there was a fire and they lost their copy of permits, so I had a 1/3 portion of my house that they didn't have permits for, and he told me that I had 30 days to rip out that portion of my house, and that the electricity, he said, this is like 90-year-old electricity, and it's not up to the new 2014 codes. And that was true because it was 90-year-old electricity. And so my experience was that they don't actually enforce short-term rental bans because it's difficult, but they can get you for secondary violations. So I just wanted to speak to that.
Great, thanks. I want to dive in and then, it looks like Shelby there. Yeah, great. One more, and then we'll jump back in.
Hi there. My name is Shelby Clark. I'm the founder of a company called Relay Rides. We do peer-to-peer car sharing, so you can rent out your car whenever you're not using it. So we got involved in a couple of legislative issues, regulatory issues, At first, it was proactive. So in 3 states, we worked with Rick in California, and then moved up to Oregon and Washington to pass legislation, clarifying what we were doing is legal and providing some additional consumer protections. And I think there were some really encouraging things. There was a lot of support for the legislation once it actually hit the floor. In California, it passed unanimously through the Senate. What passes unanimously through the California Senate? But at the same time, it was very, very challenging. In each state, we were these tiny startups, and we had huge opponents from the insurance industry. And they just kept throwing in these sort of obstructionist measures that really had no consumer benefit, but could very well have prevented us from operating at all in the state. So we came in proactive with legislation, and the very legislation that we were trying to pass almost kept us from operating in those states. So fast forward a little bit, we ran into additional issues in New York State, and were shut down around a year ago in New York State. And so, we continue to have legislative battles. I think there certainly has been a lot of support, but it's very difficult in the face of, major, very well-funded interests, and just trying to keep the options, alive and making it possible for people to share the vehicles and make mobility more accessible. Something that we feel is very important.
Yeah, great. One more in the back, and then we'll do some reactions here to all of your talk about how to be proactive.
Hi, good morning. Is this on? Good morning. My name is Corey Zengobat. I'm from the Boston Redevelopment Authority. Some of you might have heard me speak yesterday, and I've spoken to some of you individually. I would say on this issue of being proactive and not reactive, with regards to legislation, we're trying to be proactive on the government side about laying the groundwork for legislation, which is very different than, I think, trying to make regulation happen, because that just doesn't happen very quickly when you're working with a bureaucracy. And so I think that we in Boston have been thinking about other forms of partnerships that some are proactively led by us, but some are proactively proposed by the different companies that focus more around civic partnerships that are a kind of collaborative mechanism that helps lay this groundwork. So I would just say there's a spectrum of proactivity, and the end game can be legislation, or it can't be, or it can or it can't be, but we need the kind of necessary time to figure that out.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks. Any just initial reactions to some of the stories that we heard?
Yeah, I think, as Dan said, it's important to make a distinction between legislation and regulation, right? So in trying to influence the regulatory process, there are far fewer decision makers. Many regulatory bodies are appointed by the governor of a state or the mayor. It is not, as Dan said, a democratically run process. So to understand who you're working with in the regulatory environment is really important. These people are often serving longer terms. It's hard to remove them. They are more academic and more insulated than legislators. They don't necessarily have a constituency to respond to. So with regulation, if you seek to change regulation, you're essentially seeking to change common law. There's precedent. And so a regulator will look at what currently exists on the books and determine whether the rules can be adjusted to reflect some new demand. Legislation, on the other hand, can be a brand new idea where there's no precedent and can be generated by constituents, but you obviously need champions. So part of the process is to find those champions for whom there's some benefit. There may be a job creation opportunity that legislator sees. There may be a demographic they're trying to appeal to. And that's really important to find that champion. And then 2 other quick thoughts is, because this story several of these stories remind me of the importance of telling stories. And so I think being able to highlight who's benefiting. We heard a great story over on this side of the stage about a number of people showing up. So putting a human face to this, doing some profiles, written profiles that explain who's benefiting, who's using these services. So, and the broader the demographic, the better, in order to convince legislators that this isn't a small clique of people. And then finally, in certain markets, it may be interesting to look at public polling, opinion polling, that can demonstrate that there is in fact public support for this. And you can hire polling firms and they can develop questions with you. It's not a cheap process, but public opinion polls can really help not only sway the thoughts of legislators, but also change the narrative within the media. Because the media is going to be a major player in determining whether this industry, broadly speaking, succeeds or not. If the New York Times continues to write negative articles or other papers, that's not going to help the case. It's not going to convince legislators or regulators. So this has to be a multifaceted strategy of being proactive. You have to get in front of the media, explain the story, show them the benefits, and then talk to legislators and regulators.
Yeah. And I think one of the more important things as well, all of those great highlights, because one of the things is, and you mentioned it, how do you sort of become proactive, when you're dealing in the trenches, when you're getting attacked every single day? It's really about what we kind of call ME, at eBay, and that means basically mobilize and educate, with our government relations. So the mobilizing part, I think your industries have a awesome opportunity, and I know Peers has done an awesome, great first step on actually educating and mobilizing the sharing community around initiatives and educating lawmakers or policymakers and regulators about what you do. But I think that's so important, is getting out there as much as possible. And it doesn't have to be, storming City Hall. It can be little things like having quiet coffees in your, local council member's office. It can be just going out and attending, not doesn't have to be a political fundraiser, but just they have a lot of these days, community days, things of that nature, to show up. And a lot of these things are free. A lot of times they're looking for people to advertise their booths and those opportunities for the community. So I think there are opportunities to do it. It takes a lot of work to sort of dig in to find out where those opportunities are. But I think the power of people, and I know this has been said for years and years, but power of people makes a lot of difference with policymakers when you do the education on the proactive side.
Yeah, I was going to say that in that line, that at some point, though, some organizations end up doing the heavy lifting. I think who knew back when that auctioneers were such a strong constituency, right? When we started, we had to go through a 2-year process with a local agency, BART, to prove that we were providing benefits to commuters and to BART and so on. It took 2 years, lots of studies, lots of work to get them just to a point where they would allow us to park at stations and serve there. I think Airbnb is now doing a lot of this work too. They're running big time into it, and it will smooth things over time, so other organizations will be able to operate in a smoother manner. But one other aspect that I've seen is that we are often our own worst enemy on this. A lot of organizations are withholding information. They've been requested by local municipalities or groups to share some of the information to verify some of the claims they make about what they're doing. And as soon as they say, not so much, we're not going to do that, there's going to be a defensiveness that happens among legislators, among regulators, and so on. That doesn't help us. Anytime you want to go into a town and use, especially in shared mobility, the public good, the public right of way, and you say, but you just have to believe me, I'm going to be doing good things, you're going to run into a brick wall. And it hurts everybody, I believe.
Yeah. We've seen that happen in a few different places and in a lot of transportation and mobility. What else? That's an interesting pivot into what you all are seeing that's really working, like in your own experiences, or that you're seeing other sharing economy groups or platforms, advocacy groups, community groups. Have you seen anything that's like, wow, that was a great idea, we should do more of that, or that was a huge mistake, we should avoid things like that in the future, related to trying to influence regulators?
I don't have a specific example, but I think to this, if I could go back to that point you just made earlier about, there are two real big challenges, I think. One is if people aren't sharing information and they're suggesting that trust is a sufficient metric or indicator for policymakers to base a decision on, I'm skeptical about that, based on my experience in Washington and in state capitals. That may not be sufficient because that's not an industry, the political environment is not an industry that bases many decisions on trust, some, but not many. And then the other thought is around this issue of the first mover. I think if there are some coordinated campaigns, Kit, where whether it's Peers or American Sustainable Business Council or other organizations pick a few states in a few industries and target those, that can make a big difference because it is very expensive initially, and as disaggregated as this industry is, it's very time consuming and very expensive to make any progress, I think. And that may be just the nature of how things evolve, because this is if we live in a federalist political system, there's towns, there's cities, there's states, there's a national government. That's the way things work in the United States. That's fine. And if we're looking to scale this more quickly, then probably a bit more of a national strategy is in place, in order.
But continuing to pay attention and use the networks that exist in each community, I think, is something that's critical. I mean, one of the things that the sharing economy has going for it in terms of spokespeople is that you don't need to be, and in many cases probably shouldn't be, the spokespeople for your companies. It should be the drivers and the hosts and the sellers and these folks who are getting out there and telling their their legislators and their councilmen that this is why I am doing this. I mean, it should be the 55-year-old retired teacher who's jetting around the world and staying in Airbnbs who's making this case to folks back home. And in this regard, I recommend to you the work of the Institute for Justice, which is a libertarian litigation organization. And they litigate, for instance, they did a case recently to break the funeral home monopoly in Louisiana and allow a group of monks there who had been hand-making caskets for 2 centuries to sell them directly to, this is not the right word here, but consumers. And they have this I Am IJ campaign, and they have one of the head monk or whatever he's called of it's called an abbey, standing out there, and it's just like a paragraph by him about we've been doing this for 200 years, we're selling great caskets to people at a lower price, boom. And he's the spokesperson for it, not a litigator in Arlington, Virginia, and not a legislator in Baton Rouge.
Yeah, I mean, to add on to that one, and that's exactly right. I mean, it's really the power of back to the power of people and mobilizing, not us on the stage, but actually the people that are actually operating, the operators, your workers that are actually out there making a living. What's made a huge difference to us in eBay over the years, I mean, most of our disruptive fights have been us against kind of the world, whether it can be auctioneers back in the day or pawnbrokers back in the day, or whether it be today, it'll be retailers, And we've been dealing with a humongous issue on internet sales tax fight. It's just eBay against literally the world and all big retail around the country. And because of the power of what we call our eBay Main Street members, which is not me, it's folks that have signed up for it. These are eBay operators, these are PayPal merchants, those are individuals and small businesses that care about their business. When we mobilize them on Capitol Hill, whether that be through fly-ins to Capitol Hill and meeting with their members of Congress, or most importantly, the grassroots campaigns that we did. We had a bill, internet sales tax, that passed the Senate last year. We mobilized on the House side. We were able to send over 1 million letters across the Capitol, and it was one of the largest grassroots campaigns that has ever been done. Our team got an award from the Public Affairs Council because of that. So it's really about the power of the folks that are out there, that are running the businesses, that have real lives, that are relying on the sharing economy to actually grow their business and to be contributing members of their society. So again, back to the people and mobilize your folks, and I think that's the best way to go in order to sort of change the mindset of folks. And that's what's worked for us. What hasn't worked, though, and conversely, is saying what we won't do. And I think back to what we said before, and what you said before as well, is that you can never go to a regular and say, I'm not doing this, and that's just has never worked for us. I've never seen an industry that's been successful when you just put up the hand and say, no dialogue here.
Yeah.
I've never met an UberX or a Lyft driver who didn't have an interesting story.
Yeah.
Right.
And if Thomas Friedman has been writing taxi driver wisdom into columns for 25 years in the New York Times, then surely Lyft drivers and UberX drivers are just as interesting and just as good spokespeople for their companies and what they do.
Yeah. One thing that I think is difficult to sort of get a word in edgewise, when things aren't a huge catastrophe and something's not about to be shut down or there's not a cease and desist issue that's been ordered, how do we get regulators and legislators to pay attention to the grassroots community when there's not a huge crisis happening? Have you ever used tactics that help to create a sense of urgency and kind of grab a listening ear even before there's a huge problem that's going on?
Yeah, one of the ways that we kind of do it when there's quote-unquote quiet periods is to participate in sort of third-party groups. So for instance, for you all, it would be groups such as the U.S. Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities, National Association of County Officers. There's no way anybody can scale to represent every city, meet with every single mayor, every single county commissioner across the country. But there are national bodies which members and thought leaders, most importantly, that are open to dialogue, go to these meetings. I would actually look at a lot of these groups to participate in. A lot of them want to know what's going on in the sharing economy. They just don't know. And so I would look at those national organizations as a good place to sort of start to tell your story early. As a matter of fact, I was told by a colleague a couple days ago that the National Conference of State Legislatures at their summer meeting, I think it's in August in Minneapolis this year, will be hosting a forum on the sharing economy. You know, again, another great opportunity to educate policymakers about what you do. So those are some good ideas and organizations that you can sort of tap into when things aren't too hot.
Yeah.
And you can find a lot of champions with them as
I
well.
would agree with that, and even bring it down to a local community or neighborhood group, business councils that are local, the continued education at that level when an issue comes up will be a supportive group, and not just with regulators, but with politicians who don't get what the issue is yet. If they hear from constituencies that they are used to interacting with but can influence them, that's very important as well. In San Francisco recently, they're talking about on-street parking. So here's another case where you're giving the public right away to other entities, and people care about it. Parking's a very interesting subject anyways, but going to speak with these neighborhood groups, going and literally knocking on doors of businesses around there and helping them to understand what's going on is a tremendous amount of work, takes a lot of resources and time, but it has as big an impact, I think, as, you know, quite frankly, being on a panel with people who already bought into it.
Yeah, yeah. Can we break down a little bit what we mean by education? We've talked a lot about that, and I think it's a really broad term. What is it that what are some of the things that are really useful to make sure that people understand about the sharing economy, or about any issue that we're trying to get them to kind of latch onto?
Yeah, when we think about education, we're looking for what the business case is. And so who's benefiting, as we've talked about, and what new opportunities get created as a result of adopting a piece of legislation or regulation, and making that as specific to the audience's needs as possible. So job creation is obviously a huge issue in this country. Income inequality is very topical. What people get paid is very important. So these are big themes that this industry can connect to. So I think part of the education process is to find what are the broader economic themes that this industry is connecting to, and then educate the media, the elected officials and regulators and other stakeholders about how these initiatives, how these disruptions will create value for them. And then there's lots of different techniques about educating, you know, whether it's through social media or through opinion, op-eds in the newspaper, letters to the editors, or radio interviews. But the really dynamic piece of this is that because this is, and this is there are business leaders, there are owners, and then there are the customers, the users of these products. Mm-hmm. So I think an education strategy would be able to articulate both of those voices. And sometimes, you know, the media will want to hear from the business owner because that person has more credibility maybe in the eye than the user of a product. You have to suss that out. But as a strategy, having both of those teed up can be potent in educating listeners.
Yeah, I'm old enough to have gone through several of the fill-in-the-blank economy things that come through, right. And I think from my point of view, people want to know how it impacts their lives. It really comes down to, what am I going to get out of this, or how's it going to affect my community? How's it going to affect my job? They want to know how things are going to affect their lives. And when they don't know it, they either discard it because they think it's not impactful, or else you're in that phase where people are afraid, because change is scary and always has been. I think we rarely approach things from the point of view of financial or economics. We do it based on local community impact for environmental and social benefit. So the screen we use for almost everything we do isn't, is it going to make another dollar, but what impact is it going to have on the communities we operate in? So when we look at the sharing economy, we're looking at what values are being brought and what is going to be different in that local community. What works in Austin, Texas doesn't necessarily work in Seattle. And so you have to make sure that you're looking at it from a local basis as well. We last year saved $100 million over the cost of car ownership for our members. That's $100 million that goes back into the local economy. It helps pay bills. It supplements the Airbnb host as well, if they're using car sharing. That, to us, is more important than whether, quite frankly, we are providing services that are, that are not going to ever make us a dollar.
Yeah.
Yeah, and let me just clarify, because you looked at me when you said about environment. So our premise around the role of business in society is that businesses should be environmentally responsible, contribute to the general public good, and make money. So, essentially a philosophy of the triple bottom line. So I think that's a powerful argument to be made, and many of these services can identify environmental benefits that they're creating, which benefit communities, which reduce expenditures. Right. So if you can reduce carbon emissions, that's good for everybody. And so I just wanted to clarify that it's not all about the money.
Yeah, and one of the things as well, back to education, is really demystifying what's out there. There's obviously a lot of rumors, conjecture that's out there about what the sharing economy is. I think it's really important. The first step in education is really demystifying what it is not, and then explaining a very affirmative what it is, and how it benefits communities, how it creates jobs. I don't know a politician that does not like hearing jobs are being created because of this. And then look for good anecdotes. I love your point about the stories of Uber drivers or other drivers. Every time I'm in a ride-sharing car, I love hearing the stories about. I always ask them, why did you get started in this? And it's some great stories, and if you can capture those and bring folks like that into various offices with regulators and politicians, will really go a long way. That really made a big difference for us when we were able to tell stories about a small mom and pop, and how a particular proposal will put them out of business, and how they started it up, maybe because they had a disability, they started their own eBay shop, or whether it was because a single mom started their own eBay shop online, was able to actually make a living. Those stories are powerful to politicians. They listen to those. So I really would focus on the stories and demystifying sort of what's out there as well.
That's great.
I wouldn't oversell the revolutionary benefits of the sharing economy for a couple of reasons. First, if some of those revolutionary benefits don't come to fruition, it's going to be harder to go back and continue some of those relationships. And the other thing is, I think when you tell people, guys, this thing is happening, it's revolutionary, it's going to change everything, that sends up red lights, that sends up big alerts. If you can start from the perspective of, look, this is really just an extension of things that have already been going on. This is voluntary trade. It's creating jobs through a different kind of marketplace. It's a little bit different than stuff that's existed in the past, but the underlying fundamentals are basically the same as they have been in the past. I think that will put people's fears at bay a little bit. And part of the problem is that the media is complicit in this, because the media likes big, scary stories about how this is going to, the one thing that is going to revolutionize everything. Your Uber driver is going to kill you. You know, whatever it is, these are the kind of clickbait headlines that get out there, and this misinformation gets peddled. So I think telling people how a lot of what they're seeing is actually stuff that they've seen before is very calming and assuring.
Great, great. Let's move it back out to questions from the audience. If you have specific questions for folks on the stage or for the group at large.
Yeah. My name's Heather, and I've been working on the Airbnb fight in LA. And I'm really curious, it's sort of a two-parter. Why do you think ride sharing got regulated at the state level and the Airbnb fight is so localized? Because it would seem to me the whole taxi thing, like LA is a different city for taxis than San Francisco, than New York, certainly. And then you have a corollary, like there's a place called Dana Point by the water down near LA, and they regulated short-term rentals. But that was a kind of vacation community already, so there was an ethos of that kind of. And is this something that has to be fought neighborhood by neighborhood? There's 95 neighborhood councils in Los Angeles, and that would be really tedious. And then there's the city council, which is, I don't even know how many people. That's my next level. And then my thought was just take it straight to the mayor, because I live in Silver Lake. He used to be the council person for Silver Lake. It's a progressive neighborhood. Maybe he'll have want to lead the way. It's some pride in that. And I just wondered sort of some of that strategy. If we get so bogged down at the local level, how will we ever gain the momentum we need?
Yeah, that's a great question. Anyone have a great answer?
You know, some of these, it's a great question. And so some of these issues jurisdictionally are the purview of a municipality versus a state. So, you know, in the case, you gave the two examples of transportation and housing, is that right? And you said the housing was being regulated at the city level, but the
ride sharing got regulated in California's the first state.
Right, okay. Yeah, so my sense, and you may have a better take on this, but you know, within the regulatory apparatus of the state of California, you know, the state has, there's probably a department, I don't know specifically, but there's a department that probably has jurisdiction over what gets licensed and what's authorized. Where maybe at the city level, the housing authorities, that responsibility is not a state function. And so that part of that is constitutional within the state's constitution vis-a-vis what is reserved for the cities. And so in a lot of states, you have what's called home rule, which certain rights and responsibilities are reserved to municipalities. And that varies from state to state. So it does make it complicated, and I'm not familiar exactly with what's going on in California, but maybe you have a better sense of that.
And if anyone has any resources or anything even that might be useful to mention, that would be great too.
Well, you hit it. It's a jurisdictional issue, really. And in California, you're gonna, for all the sharing economy groups, you're going to have different jurisdictions. You're going to have the PUC, for various reasons, has some control over taxis, but also you have local controls too, and it can be very different depending on where you are. Planning codes are different in sometimes within cities, actually, but they're different wherever you're going to be, and you know you have to start with what's happening locally, and again, all groups can be influenced at some point, but it's going to take a broader group, to your point, that needs to address an issue, to raise it to the height where at the local level, at the state level, and maybe even to some degree at some point it will be at a federal level, we'll be able to be hearing the same thing, have the same basis and the same influences on them.
If
Can I just follow up? What about that group of 50 mayors that are pro-sharing economy? Is that an important base to lobby on specific, and then they could, I don't know.
Yeah, so at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, I think Ron Conway talked about it a little bit this morning. We had about, I think it might be 20, maybe there's 50 now, mayors that signed on to a Shareable Cities resolution. It was not binding, but just said, hey, we support the sharing economy in these ways. So are there things that we could be doing, again, proactively, I think, to get in and talk to some of those people so that we can, probably at the same time, it sounds what I'm hearing is we still have to keep doing a lot of the local grassroots in our neighborhood work, but are there strategies we could layer on top of that to kind of have two paths going concurrently to leverage some of that?
Yeah, I think it would be really valuable to map who those 50 mayors, if they're 20 or 50 or however many, and try to organize maybe a day or a week where constituents within this broader community can go and meet with those people with a similar set of talking points. And I think Dan made a really good comment that, about if this is seen as too revolutionary, may be very upsetting and distract from progress. So, it may sound very manipulated, but having talking points where we can all sort of be on the general same page is valuable, because that will reinforce, I think, that there is a movement and that there is benefit for these elected officials because they talk to each other. And however, I don't know how that was orchestrated with 15 people and then 50 people signing on, but that's a potent ally to build on, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's really great news. I mean, because that sort of begins the dialogue. You have 50 champions right there, and how do you sort of build on that? I go back to the groups I was mentioning before, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which you've already interacted with. There's an opportunity to present to them possibly out there, and then it'll probably pick up more champions, National League of Cities, same thing. What you need is champions, people that will say the sharing economy does X, Y, and Z, not A, B, C,
Great.
And those champions have to, I think, have a wide degree of diversity between them. If you've got 50 mayors out there who are all Democrats or independents, it's not going to look nearly as good and be nearly as effective as if you have some Republicans that are in there. And that's why I think that you need to make the case to Republicans and conservatives in a different way than you would probably make it to a lot of the Democratic mayors. But it's important to have that bipartisanship within the coalition.
Yeah, that's a great point. I see a hand raised very high back there.
Hi, so my name is Jesse, and I'm from BayShare. We bring together sharing economy companies and organizations, and we integrate them into the fabric of neighborhoods and cities. I have a couple comments. I'll go in chronological order. Trust score, and then I have a question to finish up. The trust score. When we think of trust, for us, it's normally subjective. However, for these companies, they are gathering massive amounts of data. Now, it's all protected. No one should be alarmed, but this data is actually binary data. So I'll use the eBay score as an example because everyone's more familiar with that. You have a review on eBay, which is text. However, you also have whether that item arrived on time, which is binary. You also have whether it was broken or not, binary. So those are very definitive answers about whether someone fulfilled their duties in the transaction or not. So hopefully, in the future, after I talk with some more politicians and convey that information, we'll move forward on that subject. But I just wanted to clarify what a trust score is. Second comment, U.S. Conference of Mayors resolution. It's 15, and I believe it's bipartisan. We have San Francisco, New York, but we also have Louisville, Kentucky, Chicago, Minneapolis. So those mayors were briefed last year, a year ago, when they agreed to this at the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting. They all signed this document saying, yes, we are going to work to generate awareness or build our own awareness. They all agreed to form task forces about sharing economy working groups and things. Most of them have not. So, I mean, my question is, we've gone to the U.S. Conference of Mayors. We've got people signed a document. They've committed to do something. I can bug them all day, every day. What is going to push them over the edge to actually form that task force? Is it the media?
So,
is it looking poor, looking terrible in front of the media? Was that work? I mean, I would love to not have to do that.
So there are a bunch. So first, you have to hold them accountable for making that public statement.
To who?
To set up a task force.
How do I hold them accountable?
Well, you could, I mean, there are a number of things. You could come up with a slate of candidates, and I use candidates in a non-electoral way. You could recommend to them, here are 13 people that would be happy to sit on a task force. So you could propose that to them and write that down, send that to them. And that helps their thinking, because this is obviously not a priority to them yet, because they need to hear from more people. So I think they also need to hear from a broader constituency than just one or two folks. And you could certainly go and meet. You're probably not going to meet with the mayor initially, but you can meet with their chief of staff, or you can meet with whomever is tasked with creating these kind of task forces. The easier you can make it for them by pointing out, again, to them who could sit on a task force, who could help solve this problem, who could help move this agenda forward. Because they have, you know, for better or worse, they sign dozens of these proclamations a year and don't follow through with, you know, a half of them. But that's an aspirational statement on their part that you now need to, you know, put into action.
One question I have, are you all members of the U.S. Conference of Mayors?
I am not. I don't think I mean, it's San Francisco.
Yeah, okay.
So I mean, Ed Lee signed the document.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it probably would start, I mean, truth is when you're a member, you know, of an organization, you know, they sort of respond to membership as well.
Can you be a member and not be mayor?
I'm sorry?
Can you be a member and not be a mayor?
Yeah, oh yeah, there's corporate members, nonprofit members, et cetera, yeah. Anyone can be a member, yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm. So that would be a big start, so yeah.
Great. Other questions? Okay, we've got one here, Matt.
So my experience with the local community elections was that we had great success, or I would say improved success, when we really defined a specific area of the sharing economy when we were trying to advocate its benefit. I'm involved in the sharing economy, and even for me, it's very confusing. There's a lot of different pieces all working together. There's different forms of the sharing economy. And so I think one of the things, sort of in speaking to your point about being proactive with legislation, being proactive with these decision makers, is that a mission statement that says that the Association of Mayors, whatever it was called, supports the sharing economy, that's a great big idea, but it's, in my opinion, maybe not as concrete as we'd like in order to sort of enact actual change. And maybe someone actually today from the Althea Foundation gave me some advice. When you're involved in these discussions or this movement and you're trying to enact policy change, it's sometimes you get a better end result by staying more focused and being more specific, so that instead of saying, well, we just support this grand idea of the sharing economy, which is kind of hard to define, that we support this one specific area. And I think it's speaking to Dan's point that if you can get a legislator or an elected official to commit to, for example, home sharing, you can then leverage, you can hold them accountable. It's easy because they've agreed to one specific issue, so it's easier to take them to task to follow through. But once you've gotten them to follow through, you can then leverage that in the bigger discussion to further members of the public and say, okay, what we're trying to do now with issue B is the same thing we did with home sharing. We want to take that to bike sharing. We want to take that to other forms of the sharing economy. I think that sometimes, in my opinion, and in my experience with the Silver Lake election, was a more effective way to converse with people.
I think that's a great point, and I'd take it one step backward, and I'd say let's start at point zero. You know, when I go into someone's restaurant and I order a burger or a salad or whatever, we're trading on that. When I go to my friend's house and I have dinner with him, he's giving me something. When something like Feastly comes up, that's just kind of a combination of those two things. And we don't regulate individuals' homes when they have friends over for dinner. And we're very used to the idea of going into a restaurant and paying for a meal. And this is just kind of a little from column A and a little from column B. It's not something that you need to be, really scared about. It's not something that's undermining the fabric of society.
Yeah, I'd add to that I think, when I spend time on Capitol Hill in Washington, we're focused on really two things. One, what's the narrative within which our specific ask fits? So if we're talking about a carbon tax or doing away with subsidies for agribusiness, we want to give the frame, the overall story about why we think that's a problem, that agribusiness is receiving billions of dollars in subsidies while early stage farmers aren't, just as an example. But then we want to make a specific ask. So if they understand the context, just as you've suggested about the sharing economy, then what we need you to do, what we'd like you to do, is support this particular initiative or these two initiatives, which are part of the sharing economy. And that makes it easier for them to understand what it is you're talking about. That gives them some context. Because maybe in contrast to the resolution that was signed, that's very easy for a mayor to do. It's harder for them to get behind a particular initiative, but if they do, then they're really bought in.
That's great.
Right, and to sort of piggyback on that is really make your message simple, you know. Just be honest about it. There's an audience out there in the public sector, and talking more about the political sector, that just do not understand the sharing economy at all. And they hear, oh my goodness, you know, somebody actually stays in somebody else's house, you know, so there's got to be something wrong with that. So you got to understand that. Back to demystifying, you know, and saying this is what it is. And back to your point, this is what's been going on forever, you know. So it's really about sharpening your message, saying what it is, and then coming back and saying what it is not. Because politicians, the learning curve is steep, you know. There's many of them out there to get it really quick, but there's a lot of them just still don't even understand the Google machine, as they call it, in a couple of offices I've been to. So you have to really hone in on your message, make it simple, and explain exactly what it is to them.
That's great. Other questions from folks? Anything else? Raphael? God, calling on people by name. We've really been at the sharing conference for like 48 hours.
I'm actually very happy to hear you because most of the things you've said is the things that we've already done. Okay, so I would like to share a conclusion. A conclusion with you all, okay, of something that really works. So we have been mobilizing and we've been educating. It was very easy to mobilize and educate people who were in crisis. Okay, it was just like very simple. You cannot pay your bills, just try this. And then people just found the sharing economy and they loved it. How could we tackle those who didn't need the sharing economy? Those who just didn't want it? Well, what we found was very efficient was to educate teenagers, infants. Just tell them how it works. So what we saw is that when they went home, they said, hey, you know what? I just found a system where we can pay just half as much, have twice as much as fun, and take a look at it. Look, we can go to Paris, we can go to London, we can go to Uruguay, you know, for half the price. Just take a look at this. And it was the teenagers talking to their parents. Considering infants, people up to 8 years old, we just explained the sharing economy, and we explained the industrial economy. They didn't understand the industrial economy. You know, for them, sharing economy was just so obvious. You know, that's how it should go. Industrial economy had so many questions they just didn't understand. I just wanted to share it with you.
That's great. What other strategies or tactics have we not covered that we should have talked about when we're thinking about how to proactively sway or influence regulators and legislators?
Well, I'd like to go back to the idea of being open to sharing information. And data's got a different feel to it, but it comes down to data sometimes. The more proactive we all are in even suggesting research or suggesting ideas on how we can show the impact, the more open, I think, regulators, legislators, and quite frankly, just the community is going to be to what we're trying to achieve. Not everything has the same impact. Doesn't mean it doesn't have value or benefit, but being able to share information and being proactive with it, I think will go a long way to dealing with sort of the defensiveness that I've seen around the country.
How do we, as a grassroots community, measure and show impact? So I think there's the idea that platforms have a lot of data potentially. I know Airbnb does a great job releasing economic impact studies, but there's tons of other studies that all of these platforms could be doing, when and if they ever have the time to do that, which is probably the thing that's stopping them from doing it. But are there things that we could do as a grassroots community, or as the people that are sort of powering these platforms to measure and show the impact?
Well, first of all, I think you need to separate some of the companies that are in there. Anything that's using public infrastructure, the public right-of-way, the public good, or is potentially being seen by some as being illegal based on current regulations, you have to put that into one category. Other category is people doing, and I love the word simple, but people are doing very simple things, exchanging, bartering, taking food, there's been catering companies out there. People have had pick things up at Trader Joe's that are prepared all the time, have them delivered. Things
In
like that.
1776, Adam Smith was writing about the propensity of man to truck, barter, and exchange, and George Washington was having guests stay at his house in Mount Vernon, which was 14 miles or a day's ride away from Washington, D.C. This is as old as our country.
Right. So some of this can be brought down to a very simple level. The fact that there's technology driving some of this now, most of it actually, is the thing that is disruptive for a benefit. It's creating an outcome. People get afraid of things that are disruptive just for disruption purposes, or at least that's how they perceive them. So bringing it back down to that simple level, I think, is really important. Back to the basically public infrastructure, public good thing. It's different because it is more highly regulated, and whether we like it or not, people feel entitled to the public good. They feel it's part of what they have, so it changes things.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point, the distinction between the individual who has initiated a project, a business, vis-a-vis what eBay, what Airbnb, what Uber is doing. I mean, those are viable businesses that are probably quite cash positive. So I think one of the strategies might be to go to the larger companies and say, it's in your self-interest to kick in. Because if we want to legitimize this larger industry here, we need more money to do these studies. We need more money to hire people in Washington, et cetera, et cetera. And there are lots of examples where the lead players in an industry have recognized, it's in their interest. They can hire their own team, and they do. But they can also help to build a broader industry. They may volunteer that, but more likely, based on precedent, they need to be asked to come together in a better funded, better organized campaign. And I think that could have quite a bit of impact quickly. But this other point about companies that are working in spaces where there's a tax implication, that's a whole nother story, and that is going to just inevitably generate a lot of controversy. Because if there's anything we know about cities, is they all are cash starved.
Yeah.
And as the sequester, filters through the national economy, whether you think that was a good idea or not, municipalities have less money, states have less money. And so in many places across the country, elected officials are still trying to figure out how they're going to have enough money to fund the basic requirements of doing business. Some states are cutting taxes, which means public services will fall. Some people think that's a good idea. I don't. But cities will, I think, really resist anything that takes money out of their pocket.
And I think on that issue, it's important to bifurcate the tax question from the regulatory question. So let's get back to, you probably wouldn't want to do this in a meeting with someone, but let's get back to 101 and talk about why we tax and why we regulate. We tax because we have to find a way to collect money to provide certain things that are public goods and that are demanded by the public. We regulate in order to deal with market failures, so information asymmetries, public goods, monopolies, and externalities. Those two things have on their surface nothing to do with one another. So take the hotel tax. Why are hotel taxes 18% in New York? Because that's a way that New York City can export its tax burden to visitors. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's just the way that it is. The discussion on whether and how Airbnb hosts should be paying taxes has nothing to do, nothing whatsoever, with the regulatory question of, is there a monopoly issue here? Are there information asymmetries between hosts and guests? Is there a market failure here? And is there a public good element here? And I think to the extent that you can deal with those issues separately, you can avoid allowing people who are more skeptical to conflate the two.
And Kit, your question about what are some of the subjects we may not have touched upon, we touched a little bit on the grassroots piece, but I really think that that's a really key piece, and again, a differentiator for your industry is the power of the folks that are out there. And one of the things, and it's got to be very targeted, you know, we've seen of the campaigns that we've done on the grassroots piece, it's just been amazing, you know, whether that be, again, back bringing people to state capitals or whether that be doing big, huge campaigns that are directed. Now, those campaigns have to actually come from constituents of these members, and that's a key thing. So when I get a thing regarding New York City, Schneiderman's not going to listen to me because I'm a California resident. So it's got to be very, very targeted to their constituents. I've never known a politician that has not listened to their constituents because one of the things that politicians care about is getting back in office. They're public servants. So understand that as well. So I think that the grassroots piece is really critical. And I kind of look at a great example of this is you know, people wonder why is there not a helmet law in the state of Colorado for motorcycles? And it's pretty simple, because the lobby there in Colorado and the bikers there, every year there's a piece of legislation dropped there in Denver that would actually mandate helmets on bicycle riders. They storm up to the state capitol, and those bills die pretty quickly. So again, the power of people, the power of mobilization will make a big difference.
Great. Great.
I just make one comment, picking up on something that you said earlier about the tech question. I think obviously the sharing economy and the way that it's evolving would not be possible without tech, but I think when you're talking to policymakers and regulators, it's good to kind of downplay that element, because when people think tech, they start thinking, or especially older politically minded folks, they start thinking about Google Glass and drones and other big scary stuff. And if what you can do is focus the fact on this is marketplace, this is a marketplace, these are buyers and sellers who are coming together. This isn't, you know, people putting drones in your bedroom window or any of the other weird, scary stories that people hear about some of the gee whiz tech out there.
That's great.
Another thought is going back to this comment about, you know, the blank economy and whether it's the new economy, the sustainable economy. You know, there have been lots of these terms over the past, at least, you know, my lifetime, and I'm sure preceding that. So one suggestion is to, you know, better understand what these different constituencies want. So for instance, there's a national group called the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, which supports a buy local frame. That's the most important thing within that community. Bali is in, I think they have 75, 80 chapters across the US. They have thousands of small businesses. These are Main Street businesses. They may think the sharing economy is a good idea, or they may find it extremely disruptive to their business models. I think before it gets too much further along, it'd be a good idea to have conversations with members of that community who you may find alignment with and maybe not. I know, for instance, we were talking about the Marketplace Fairness Act. Many of these businesses felt that products sold on the internet that weren't being taxed with sales tax would put them at a disadvantage. Why should I be paying sales tax for my local bookstore, but if I'm buying it on Amazon, I'm not paying sales tax? So that was an issue that really mobilized the local Main Street business community. And you know, there were lots of nuances about how much the limit, where the cap should be on how much my revenue was in order for me to pay tax. But the story is, I guess the moral of the story is that, you know, looking for alignment with other broad-based groups that have a vision of changing the economy is important.
Yeah, that's great. Proactively building allies. It sounds like another good thing to do in quiet time, as
In the
you
quiet
said,
time,
David. Well, we're just about wrapped up here. This has been really fantastic. I feel like I've gotten so many concrete examples of things that we could be doing. So I really appreciate all of you taking your time and sharing so generously all the knowledge that's in your head. I think it's one of the best things that we can do when we get together is be generous with what we know and what we've experienced. So thank you very much for doing that. And thank you all for coming and listening and for your participation in the dialogue. It was great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.